If you want to write stories your readers will love, there are 3 things you need to do. First, understand storytelling principles. Second, see how other writers have applied those principles. And then finally, use them in your own work. Here on the Story Nerd podcast, our goal is to demystify story theory. We'll help you with the first 2 steps so that you can get started with the third. I'm Melanie Hill, writer, editor and poet, and I have a passion for middle grade and young adult stories, spy stories, fairy tales and master detective novels.
And I'm Valerie Francis. I'm a writer and literary editor, and I focus on stories by, for, and about women.
On today's episode, Valerie and I look back over season 2 and discuss what we've learnt about the hero's gift expressed and the forces of antagonism. And before we get onto the main topics of conversation, we'd really love it if you could give the show a rating and review. For Apple Podcast listeners, you can do it right from your phone. Simply go down to the show's landing page and scroll to the bottom. It's that simple. Right, Valerie, why don't you start us off first by telling what your big aha moments were with respect to the hero's gift expressed?
Well, what I find most fascinating is that the stories we enjoyed the most were the ones where the hero's gift and the forces of antagonism were working well. The writers of these films understood how stories worked, and they used it to their advantage. Now, of the 10 films we watched this season, I think the concept of the hero's gift expressed was best used in Legally Blonde, The Invisible Man, The Matrix, and A Few Good Men. Promising Young Women is an excellent film. It really is. But I'll be honest, I have to study that one more to fully appreciate everything that's going on there. So I want to set that one aside for now and just talk about the other ones. With the first 4 that I mentioned, I think it's interesting that the hero's gift is approached the same way in each of these movies. And I bet if we studied 100 more examples of stories that work well, we'll see the same approach. So let me recap the key things to remember about the hero's gift and how it's expressed. First, the hero must have a gift. I know that sounds obvious, but you'd be surprised. Unless you and I, as writers, are thinking about that, we can easily forget. So at some point, we need to decide what gift our main character has. And it might take you a while to discover it. It might take a bit of work, but that's okay. In your first few drafts, or maybe even your first few books, the gift you give your character might be something you've observed in another story. And that's okay. As long as you're taking inspiration from someone else and not plagiarizing them, obviously. So maybe your character will have a physical skill or a talent, or maybe they see the world in a unique way, or maybe they have knowledge that the others don't. Okay, the second idea is that the gift must be established in the first 10 minutes or first 10 pages. The first 10 pages of a story, whether it's a novel or a screenplay, are very important. They're crucial, actually. Why? Because this is your sales pitch. Now, I know that is a crude way to put it, and we don't like to think about having to sell our stories. It took me a long time to wrap my head around that. But that's what we're doing here. As the author, you get 5 to 10 pages to convince your reader to keep reading. That's what I mean by selling them on the idea of continuing to read. Now, your reader could be someone standing in a bookstore or scrolling the page on Amazon. It could be an agent you've queried. It could be an acquisitions editor at a publishing house. It could be a film studio executive. It could be an actor like Reese Witherspoon looking for her next project. Whoever it is and wherever it is, you've got to get their attention in 10 pages. You've got to hook them. There is a tried and true way to do it, and part of that strategy is to establish the hero's gift. Now, on this note, I have gotten questions about exactly what goes in these first 10 pages. What is this tried and true method I keep talking about? And I am putting something together for you to answer that question, so watch this space, or better yet, subscribe to my inner circle, valeriefrancis.ca/inner circle, because you'll hear about it there for sure. Now, the gift, once we've decided what it's going to be for our main character, the gift must be special. Whatever it is the character can do, it must be superlative in the world of the story. For example, in Legally Blonde, there are dozens of women in that sorority who have a better than average understanding of fashion and beauty. Elle, though, is the best of the best. So, how do we convey this idea to our reader? Well, first of all, the other characters in the story express the gift. They let us know that our main character has a gift that the other people in that world don't have. And then we also, as the writer, have to create a scene that demonstrates that gift to the reader. As we saw in the episode we did on Death on the Nile, it is not effective if the hero brags about having a gift. And it's not effective if the audience never gets to see the gift. What's particularly interesting about this part is that the hero might not actually recognize that what they can do is a gift. Neo doesn't think he's particularly gifted. And in fact, he isn't at the beginning of the story. He is not the best. But then that's exactly how stories of the chosen one variety work. The hero's behavior throughout the story must be in keeping with the gift. This was a huge takeaway for me from Death on the Nile. Poirot's gift was established 100 years ago when Agatha Christie created him. It's his little gray cells. In other words, it's his ability to think coolly, calmly, rationally, and logically. He's able to put his feelings and his emotions aside and look at the facts of the case to solve the crime. Kenneth Branagh seemed to disregard this in favor of creating emotionally charged scenes to highlight his own skill as an actor. The effect of this, then, is that Poirot's gift was watered down, and it made him much less special than he actually is. Alrighty, the next point is that the gift must pop up in the story every now and then. So the gift is initially established in those first 10 pages, as I said, but then it needs to come up. It's not that we establish it and then abandon it. It's got to sort of bubble to the surface every so often. That said, the gift is not fully expressed until the story's climax. The reason the hero's gift is such an important concept to understand is that it is directly connected to the story's climax. And the climax, of course, is the moment your reader is waiting for. It's the highest point in the story when your protagonist and your antagonist lock horns. This is it. Your whole story is building to this one moment, this climax. If the hero expresses her gift, she triumphs over the villain. And it's a positive or up ending. And the story is called a prescriptive tale. Now, if she does not express her gift, the villain will triumph over her. Therefore, it's a negative or down ending, and the story is a cautionary tale. Elvis's story is a cautionary tale. And I don't think I'm ruining the story by saying that. We all know how it ends. Seriously, guys, you've got to watch Elvis because we're going to talk about it here on the show. I'm just giving you all time to see it because I don't want to ruin it for you. Now, if the gift is expressed too early in the story, as it was in Booksmart, then the story has nowhere to go. And the climax isn't going to be a climax. It's not really going to make sense. And finally, the hero's gift must be expressed on the page. Seeing the gift expressed is one of the things your reader is waiting for. Now, they won't be able to articulate it that way because it's not their job to understand how stories work. That's our job. But trust me, just trust me on this. And if you don't trust me, trust Lisa Cron. Go read Wired for Story. From the moment the gift is revealed in the beginning of the story, the reader and the viewer, if you're writing a screenplay, are waiting for it to come back bigger and better. A little seed has been planted in their mind, and they're subconsciously tracking it, and they're waiting for it to pop back up. When it does, the expression must be on the page. In other words, include the expression in a working scene so that the reader can enjoy it. Don't reference it happening somewhere else. Now, to help you understand what I mean by on the page or off the page, in Pride and Prejudice, Lydia's elopement with Wickham is off the page. We don't see it happening, we just know it happened. So the expression of the gift, the ultimate expression in its full potential, is expressed in the climax of the story, which is on the page. Okay, I think I hit all the points. Melanie, what do you think about the hero's gift expressed?
Well, I've really enjoyed listening to you this season and also focusing on this in my own watching and analysis. So, first of all, thank you for, for putting this in as a topic of study. And like you, I really enjoyed realizing that both of the areas that we were looking at are actually quite complementary. And that sort of leads me into my aha moments for this season with the hero's gift expressed. And when we look at the moment when the antagonist is defeated, like you just mentioned, or the force of antagonism is overcome, that is when we see the hero's gift expressed. So that was a big aha moment for me. And this season confirmed my understanding that of this intersection happens at the all is lost moment. And at this moment, that's when the forces of antagonism mostly lose, because the protagonist combines all their lessons, so the obstacles and the challenges that they faced and all the lessons that come from that, with their gift to overcome that final obstacle, and which is thrown down by the forces of antagonism. And it's usually very rewarding. And like you said, you do need to see it to walk away with a sense of satisfaction at the end of a story. And some other points that I was thinking of when we were preparing for this episode was that the hero's gift can't be a surprise at the end. I think the gift, like you mentioned, must be evident early, and it must also make sense for the character. And the only exception that I could think of this season was when we were looking at The Matrix, because that's a chosen one story. And while we didn't see Neo's gift at the start, and we saw it at the end, it still made sense when it was revealed, because he was working in that technology world. And so when the gift comes out as an ability to see through the programming, it still made sense, even if it wasn't right there at the beginning of the movie. It was the world that he lived in, so he was familiar with it, and he had enough credibility in it to actually have that appear a bit later on in the story. So I thought that was very interesting as well. But generally speaking, we really do need to see that hero's gift up front. And I have thought a lot recently about your proposition regarding the superhero's alter ego's gift. So this is from when we were watching Captain Marvel. And from memory, you put forward the idea that the alter ego has a gift that is based more on their personality or their character flaws or character strengths. And it's a unique gift, and it needs to combine with the superpower. And that is the key for the hero to unlock their full potential. So it's one thing to have a superpower, but then it's another thing to use it in a way that fulfills the obligations, I suppose, and the responsibility of having that power. And I think that is a really great premise to start from when writing superhero stories. So I thought that was an excellent proposition to put forward. And the other thing that I noticed was the gift doesn't have to be grand. So it can be something that's very everyday, such as fashion knowledge or an ability to play football well. So they were some things that I really picked up, and I think are important maybe for writers to consider when they're looking at the hero's gift expressed. So what would be your best advice then for authors as they reflect on what we've studied, and what would be the best advice that you would give them?
Well, the bottom line here is that the gift must be established in the first 10 pages and expressed to its full potential in the story's climax. If we remember that, I think we'll be good. All right. So Melanie, this season you studied Forces of Antagonism. All right, lay it on me. What did you discover?
Right. Well, I started out by using a definition of the force of antagonism, and the one that I used was an antagonist or a force of antagonism is someone or something that challenges the protagonist. That challenge creates conflict between the protagonist and the force or forces of antagonism that drive the story forward and make a reader want to read on. And I identified 5 possible groups of antagonistic forces, which were the first one, a villain, which is a person with evil intentions trying to destroy the protagonist. The second was a conflict creator. So this character's goal directly conflicts with the protagonist's want. Not their need, their want. I'll just point that out. The third was inanimate forces. So this is non-human powers or elements such as the weather, gravity, time, wildlife, or other environmental factors. The fourth was corrupt entities. So entities that pose a challenge or threat to the protagonist's goals. A corrupt or immoral entity can sometimes act as a more systemic version of an evil antagonist or a villain, I suppose. And finally, the protagonists themselves. And this is where the protagonist's own insecurities or fears create an internal conflict that thwarts their own goals. So self-sabotage, in a way. So one of the big takeaways for me was using different sources for the forces of antagonism in your story. So, for example, having a villain, a conflict creator, and the environment will give you multiple ways to create obstacles for your protagonist. However, the forces of antagonism must make sense for the story you're telling. They must highlight the point your story is trying to make. So the majority of the human antagonists that we've had must have their own reasons for their actions. And they must be the protagonists in their own story. So we didn't study this a lot this season, but it really came through in A Few Good Men, where we had Colonel Jessup as the antagonist, who had a really strong rationale for his actions based on a belief system. And he was the hero in his own story. And that was a really good example. Even if we didn't really focus on that a great deal, it did come out in various characters this season. So that was great, because when an antagonist has a relatable reason and the reader can empathize, then a reader will experience the tension between the antagonist and the protagonist. And I think that that's something that really draws people in. So that's something to look for and think about as you write a story. We have seen some really strong forces of antagonism and some weaker or non-existent forces of antagonists this season. The strong monster villain in The Invisible Man was a standout because the character of Adrian presented a physical and psychological threat to Cecilia in that story, and the threat he posed to her escalated to a point where Cecilia was faced with a fate worse than death option. It was a really great example of one force of antagonism being so strong that it could carry a story by itself. Stories where there are multiple forces of antagonism are best when they are centered on a theme and represent different aspects of that theme. For example, Promising Young Woman and A Few Good Men. They were all centered on themes of society or honor and a few other things in A Few Good Men. This season, we also saw some examples of where there was an absence of antagonistic forces, and this created real problems in the story. In Death on the Nile, an investigator needs a crime. The crime is then a reference point for all the other clues, red herrings, and cuttlefish. The cast also provides the sleuth with a puzzle to solve by providing alternative motives and other red herrings and cuttlefish as well. In Booksmart, the lack of meaningful challenges presented by the antagonists really result in a dull story. There weren't any significant lessons the protagonists learnt from their quest to get to Nick's party, and the challenges normally provide the protagonist with lessons. So whether it's improving a physical skill or expanding the way the protagonist thinks so that they can use those lessons in that crisis moment. So when there is a lack of antagonism, it doesn't leave much for your protagonist to do at that crisis moment. And I think that's a really big lesson to take away from the movie Booksmart. So Valerie, what were your ahas this season for the Forces of Antagonism?
Well, the 5 types of antagonists that you studied this season were new to me. I'd never looked at it that way before, but it's really helpful. I particularly like the concept of the antagonist as the character or force that challenges the protagonist. I can see this being helpful in, for example, a 2-person scene. So stories need to have conflict at every level, as we discovered with Wild. So when there are only 2 people in a scene, the protagonist and somebody else, the somebody else by default is the antagonist. Now, it might not be the global antagonist or, the big villain of the whole story. It could be the protagonist's best friend. But in that moment, their behavior is antagonistic. In that moment, they are challenging the protagonist in some way. The other idea that was driven home for me this season is that the story's antagonist has to have a point. Now, this is not a new idea for me. I've known it for a long time, but I really like finding examples of it. And Colonel Jessup, as you already said, Melanie, is a prime example. So yet again, A Few Good Men. And I think we said this in the episode that we could tackle A Few Good Men from any angle and it would hold up. So whether you're an Aaron Sorkin fan or not, that's a really good film to have in your repertoire, really good one to study. Now, Jessup's behavior isn't justified. Like what he did was not okay, but he does have a point, right? We do need people like him out there doing the hard work to keep us safe. And when the antagonist has a point, the story is much richer for it. Another great example is Whiplash. We should do that one on the podcast at some point. I love that movie. So when the antagonist has a point, it keeps him or her from being, a mustache twirling cartoon character. All righty, Melanie, what is the key thing that you want listeners to remember about Forces of Antagonism?
Well, I kind of cheated and I put a few key things in. So I'm not as succinct as you, I think. But anyway, here goes. So the conflict in a story is provided by the forces of antagonism, including the protagonist who can be their own antagonist. The forces of antagonism don't need to be negative. They can be positive. And we saw this with Jules in Bend It Like Beckham, in Morpheus in The Matrix, and with Harold in A Few Good Men. The stories that had multiple forces of antagonism were the most interesting, as well as more compelling stories to watch. Good examples from this season were The Matrix, Promising Young Woman, and A Few Good Men. And the biggest lesson about the forces of antagonism this season were from the stories that didn't have strong antagonists. And these examples were particularly Booksmart and Wild. For these stories suffered because there was little to no conflict, or the sources of conflict were confused. So the big takeaway, if I can sum all of that up, is the strength of your story is determined by the forces of antagonism, because your protagonist will only be as strong as the forces of antagonism push her to be. If your story's force of antagonism is weak, then your whole story will be weak. All right, that wraps up our key takeaways for season 2. Next season, I'll be looking at sequences, and I'll provide a detailed description of what a sequence is in our first episode. But as a starting point, I'm going to use Robert McKee's explanation of a sequence from the book Story. And he says, a sequence is a series of scenes, generally 2 to 5, that culminates with a greater impact than any previous scene. And so that's from page 38. So that's as clear as mud, right? So I thought I'd provide a bit of an example of what I think is meant by that. And a really good example is the beginning of the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark. So there are a number of scenes in that opening that build up to Indiana Jones finding the cave, entering the cave, retrieving the idol, escaping with the idol, and then the idol being taken from him. So if you want to understand the concept of a sequence, I think that would be a really good place to start if it's a new concept. So why am I studying sequences? Because planning sequences is a good concept for writing, and being able to identify sequences in your work is also a great way to prevent or analyze where bits are sagging in the story. So the movies that I've chosen for season 3, and this is in order of appearance, are The Bourne Identity, Sliding Doors, Good Will Hunting, The Water Horse, and Lost in Translation. And I've chosen some interesting plot lines from these movies, with The Bourne Identity hopefully giving us a good grounding in what a sequence is, and hopefully a good example for us to use if this concept is new to you. I'm not sure exactly how I'm going to do this, but we'll see how I go. So join me for the ride. Valerie, what topic have you chosen?
Well, I'm going to study beginnings and endings of stories. In other words, the first act and the last act. A while back, I can't remember, it might have been 2017 or 2018, I learned from Stephen Pressfield that the beginning of a story and the end of a story rhyme. At the time, I didn't exactly disbelieve him, but I couldn't imagine how on earth that could be true. So I started to look into it. And he's right. Shocker. The beginning and ending of a story, they're like bookends. They work together. There are questions raised in the beginning that are answered in the end. The situation that the protagonist faces in the beginning, they face again in the end. Sometimes it's a literal replay of the same scene. So sometimes you find a scene from the first act that literally is repeated in the third act. I know that sounds crazy. I do, because I thought it was crazy when I first heard of this concept, but it's actually true. So in season 3, I'll explain how all that works and I'll give examples of it. Then, fear not, in season 4, I'm going to cover middles. Okay, so my film picks for season 3 are Tootsie, Good Luck to You, Leo Grande. Now, this is a 2022 film, so you may not have seen it yet. It stars Emma Thompson, and we will be studying that in episode 3. So you have a few weeks to take a look at it. It's available from Amazon Prime Video. Then my next choice is The Blair Witch Project. Now, nobody panic. Nobody panic. This episode airs Halloween week, and come on, it's Halloween. Throw me a bone. You got to let me have one. One of the things we're trying to do here on Story Nerd is to cover as many different types of stories as possible. And I know some of you write horror. So I thought The Blair Witch Project was apt, and Melanie has agreed to go with it. I promise you, it will be a non-creepy episode, and you will not have to watch the film if you do not want to. But what I will say is that there's a really good, solid storytelling reason for having chosen it. So even if this isn't your cup of tea and you don't want to watch the movie, that's cool. Make sure you listen to the episode. And then to sweeten the pot, my next choice is Guardians of the Galaxy, and we finish with Toy Story. So a little rough one in the middle there, but you end up with Toy Story, so that's not so bad. Now, before we wrap up today, I just want to take a minute to talk about why we end the episodes the way we do. Each week, we say, story theory doesn't have to be difficult. It's a tool to help you write more, not less. So take it one step at a time and have fun. Melanie and I believe this with all of our hearts. Too often, story theory feels overwhelming, and it can make us feel like idiots or make us want to toss our books that we're working so hard on. It makes us want to just chuck it right out the window. Sometimes it's people who make us feel like idiots, but we can walk away from them, and we should. But story theory is all about how stories work and how to write stories readers will love. If our goal is to have a career as a novelist or a screenwriter, we can't really walk away from our craft. Story theory is the thing that allows us to apply our craft. My best advice is to study with a purpose. Now, some people love writing prompts and find them useful. If that's you, then by all means, keep going with it. If it's working, just keep going. However, if you've got a work in progress right now, then use your story to explore the principles. If your goal is to finish your book, then you've got to keep working on your book. There's no reason why you can't take our action steps or any other idea that you get from our show and apply it to your writing. Now, I don't know about you, but I've already had a job that stressed me out, and I hated going to it. I've already had people in positions of authority speaking to me in ways I did not appreciate, and I left all of that behind to do this. Those things weren't fun. I refuse to allow writing to become not fun. Writing is a joyful activity. Expressing our creativity through words is fun. So please take whatever is useful from these episodes and apply them to your work. And above all, keep having fun.
Hear, hear. Right, that wraps it up for this week. Join us again next week as we kick off Season 3 with Tootsie. To support the show, please leave us a rating and review and tell your writer friends about us. For even more information about putting story theory into practice, subscribe to Valerie's Inner Circle by visiting valeriefrancis.ca/inner circle and follow her on Twitter and Instagram at Valerie_Francis. And if you'd like to find more out about me, visit melaniehill.com.au or visit me on Facebook at Melanie Hill Author. And remember, story theory doesn't have to be difficult. It's a tool to help you write more, not less. So take it one step at a time and have fun.